Hi guys, we are going to start today from doing Unit 9. And so Unit 9 is going to talk a bit about the important components for bone growth, how bone growth basically works, how bones grow lengthwise and widthwise, how we remodel bones due to use, and then a little bit about things like bone fractures. So let's review a little bit about endochondral ossification and what that is. And essentially, it's talking about bone growth.
Embryonic development, cells called chondroblasts begin secreting cartilage that develops in the shape of the skeleton's long bones. The bluish, transparent avascular tissue formed is called hyaline cartilage. As the cartilage grows, the chondroblasts in the interior calcify and die. Blood vessels penetrate the structure and deliver osteoblasts. These cells lay down bone material. As the cartilage ossifies and spongy bone forms, a medullary cavity develops. At the ends of a long bone, ossification from cartilage also occurs. This process, in which hyaline cartilage becomes bone and grows, is called endochondral ossification. Bone growth continues through childhood. After puberty, bone tissue replaces the remaining hyaline cartilage, and the shaft reaches its adult length.
And so, let me go in here. If you remember from the last unit, there's two kinds. There's two kinds of ossification, and ossification just basically means bone formation. And so you have the first one that's considered intramembranous ossification. And so with this, how this works, let me put this to A. The very first step, and this happens within the embryo. Basically here, you have osteoblasts that form, and if you remember, osteoblasts are basically osteo coming from osseous tissue, which essentially is bone tissue, right? And so blast means that they are the cells that are important for beginning those that process, or they generate something, versus when we were talking about sites, that was something that helps to maintain it. So this is going to generate it. So osteoblasts form from basically mesenchymal cells, and these are embryonic cells. And these are located within the embryonic fibrous connective tissue. And so when this happens, basically what they're going to do is, this is where we're going to get what are known as ossification centers. So essentially this is the starting point of making bone. Oops. Now, the second step that we're going to see, that basically these osteoblasts are going to start depositing this osteoid material. And basically, the osteoid material is unmineralized bone. And this osteoid material is going to be made up of basically collagen fibers, and basically these osteoblasts deposit this material, and then later these osteoblasts will end up being surrounded by bone, and basically it's extracellular material, and then they'll end up becoming osteocytes later. That's extracellular material. So they're going to end up becoming osteocytes later once we make bone. And so this osteoid material is going to start becoming calcified in the next step due to these basically osteoblasts. So and once they become calcified, they're going to form those spiracles or spiracles. And remember, those were basically the connections in the spongy bone that look kind of like that honeycomb or netting. And these are going to continue growing. So basically, you'll have this osteocyte here, right? And then, if you remember, what we saw was the lacunae that's around it. But what happens is essentially what they're doing is they're releasing this material, and that material is basically coming out and forming these kind of spike things that come out, and this is what's known as the spiracles. And so each one of these guys essentially is going to be doing this, and so this one will release it around them, and then essentially what happens is they continue growing in until they form this kind of overlapping region, or they come together. And then once they come together and get thick, this is what's going to end up being the trabeculae. So to form trabeculae. So at this point, we're starting to form the spongy bone. It's starting to come together. And then the next part of this intramembranous ossification, you're going to have what's called the peristernum, and we talked about that in class, that outer layer, right, of connective tissue. And this is going to form as that outer layer. And basically, underneath it, we're going to get woven bone, which essentially is the spongy bone. And then the very last, basically, step for this is then you'll start getting these lamellar sheets, remember? And we talked mostly about the concentric lamellar, but there were different types depending on the location. The concentric forming the osteons, or those circular structures in the compact bone, right? And so these lamellar sheets will form, and they form from the woven bone between the peristernum and the new spongy bone that's forming. Spongy bone. And this basically happens in the center of the developing bone. And this is important because it is there, and well, it's important because it adds strength. So what's made by this? Well, the most common thing are flat bone. And that's the flat bone that you can think of in the skull or the clavicle, the sternum, and some facial bones. Right? So this is essentially, as you can see, that's not a whole lot of bones types. There's tons that we talked about when we were in lab. So the more common of the two forms of bone formation or ossification is endochondral ossification, which is what we saw the video about a moment ago, which is why I put the video on there. So basically in endochondral ossification, during the first stage, during about week 8 of development, you're going to have these things known as chondroblasts. And chondroblasts are, again, you see that blast cells there, so those are the originator cells, right? Chondra, if you're thinking about it, chondrocytes we talked about when we talked about cartilage. So this should give you an idea that we're going to be making cartilage here. And basically, these guys are going to secrete hyaline cartilage. And basically, this hyaline cartilage matrix that is being made is surrounded by perichondrium. And this is basically just a dense layer of irregular connective tissue that's there. So that's how we get our beginning framework. Now, once the chondroblasts secrete the hyaline cartilage matrix and it's sitting there, it no longer is osteogenic I mean not osteogenic, it's no longer a chondrogenic cell, which means it's not making cartilage anymore. So then this chondroblast is going to change into a chondrocyte. Now the chondrocyte then goes through hypertrophy, and it dies in the second stage because the matrix begins to start to calcify. Let me just put and so get a different color here. Oh, we'll do that one. And so once we have this matrix start to calcify in this next stage, or the third stage, basically what we're going to see is a bone collar is going to start forming. And that happens in the perichondrium. And this happens because basically you have this conversion of stem cells that are there into osteoblasts. Now, once this starts happening, you're going to get this periosteal bud. And basically, these are osteoblasts and blood vessels will start to invade the center of the cartilage in the developing bone shaft. That's blood vessels, right? And so they invade the center of the cartilage. In the developing bone. And so this is what's going to form the primary ossification center. And that's just the center that starts ossifying first. And so this is going to start beginning to form spongy bone. And so this is all happening within the uterus and as the basically as the fetus is developing. Now in the fourth stage at birth, fourth stage. And so this is at birth, right? The diaphysis, is going to start elongating. And the medullary cavity, that cavity that is in the shaft or within the diaphysis, is going to start forming. Now, it forms because of osteoclast. Do you guys remember? Oh, what is going on here? I am so sorry about that. Let me start this. It's the same thing. Do we remember what osteoclasts do? If you said they reabsorb or start eating at bone tissue, you would be right. Right? Now, at the same time this is happening, you're going to start having the secondary ossification center form. And that happens in the epiphysis. So in those end parts of the bone. And then in the final stage, or stage 5, which starts in adolescence, basically ossification continues. Well, not starts at adolescence. I mean, it occurs through adolescence, and towards the end of adolescence, it's going to stop once the epiphyseal plate basically completely ossifies. Sorry about that. So the ossification centers continue in the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So on the ends and through the shaft. And this will happen until only 2 areas of hyaline cartilage are existing. And basically what you have is at the surface, up the epiphysis, and at the epiphyseal plate. And then we know towards the end of adolescence, at the beginning of adulthood, this guy right here will completely ossify. So that kind of reviews for us basically the 2 types of ossification. Now, when we're looking at postnatal bone growth, right, we have what's known as basically interstitial growth, which this is longitudinal growth, and think longitudinal as lengthwise or long ways. So this is going to increase the length of the bone, and apophysitional growth is going to be what makes the bones, or this is the growth that's increasing in bone thickness. So, is apophysitional growth, is this the increase in the length of bone, true or false? And hopefully you said false, right? Length, it's not, right? It's increasing thickness. And so let's talk a little bit about interstitial growth. And so it requires the presence of epiphyseal cartilage. And if you can see here, this right here, right there, this right here is showing you the epiphyseal plate. And the reason why you can see this line that's right here, and you can see it again up here, is because it's made out of cartilage and not bone. So the epiphyseal plate remains this constant thickness. And that's because the rate of cartilage growth on one side is balanced by the replacement of bone on the other. So basically, as you're growing, the beginning of the growth starts with making more cartilage. Now, the thing is that it's making more cartilage on one side, but the rate that we're replacing the cartilage with bone on the other, they're equal. So it's going to mean that the bone is growing longer, but we're actually making bone because the cartilage is getting converted to bone. And that rate of cartilage growth and bone replacement is equal. That's why we don't get this huge, big, thick line of cartilage at the epiphyseal plate. Now, at the same time we're getting that growth, there's this concurrent remodeling that's happening at the epiphyseal end. So think about how thick this is and then how thin this part is. So there has to be remodeling here as we grow so that this end doesn't stay this thick. So basically it's you're getting remodeling happening at the same time. Now, as we're going through here, there are 5 different zones of cartilage that's happening in this area here, right? You basically have the resting zone here. And you can look in this, looks like this quiescent zone, looks like quiet in a way, right? And that's because this guy is basically inactive. So nothing's happening here, right? Now, if you look at the next, proliferation stands for growth or making more cells. This is essentially mitosis. So you have division and very quick division happening here between cells. Hypertrophic zone. Hypertrophic means that basically it's getting enlarged or growing, right? And so this is the idea that the lacunae, or this area where these chondrocytes, and then later osteocytes are, or osteoblasts, they're getting bigger. So the chondrocytes here are getting bigger. And then remember we said in that same stage that they die? And that's because there's a zone that has calcification. So basically we're getting the cartilage going into bone, or about to in this area, because you're getting the release of calcium here, right? And the ossification or the osteogenic zone, this is where you're starting to get the calcified spiracles, right? That essentially will end up being all the spongy bone. So let's look at this in the next picture so that we can see what all of this stuff looks like. And so this is a picture that's showing you essentially what's happening. So this basically is showing the end of the epiphysis is here and the diaphysis is here, right? And so this is towards the epiphysis and this is towards the diaphysis, right? And so this resting zone that's here, you can see that essentially that cartilage that's there is just nice and balanced and nothing's happening. As you go into this next zone, this is where the cartilage is going to start multiplying. So you can see here that you're getting a lot more of these kind of chondrocytes being formed because they're dividing in half. Now, if you look here, do you notice how these cells, these are older cartilage cells, they're starting to get bigger and bigger. And then we're going to have the calcification that starts happening. And basically, you're going to start getting the cartilage that's dying, right? And so these all happen within the same step earlier when we're talking about, because this is essentially an example of endochondral ossification, or part of the remodeling here. And so the matrix begins to start to deteriorate because the cartilage is going away and you're starting to get ossification. So here you can see a spiracle that's starting to form. And then sooner or later you're going to get another one that forms, and then you're going to end up forming the trabeculae. And this is all that osseous tissue here, right? And so those are all the different layers that you have. Now, when we are talking about it, most of the time this epiphyseal plate, this is what this is right here, right? It becomes closed for females on average at the age of 18 years, and for males on average the age of 21 years. Now, it can be plus or minus for individuals, but when we talk about averages, this is what we're talking about. Now, when we're talking about the bone remodeling here at the epiphyseal plate, just a reminder that you are going to need osteoclasts to start breaking down some of the sides of the epiphysis as this gets bigger and it starts elongating here to keep it the great size. If things aren't right, if you're not getting this big area here and this thinner area down here, the joint won't work here, right? So you're going to have the remodeling where it comes out. And then here, it's going to be way too thick. So let's think about all of this. Interstitial growth, let's talk about what applies here. It requires epiphyseal cartilage. It allows the epiphyseal area to get thicker. C, cells in the hypertrophic zone are proliferating by mitosis. The active zone is towards the epiphysis. And ossification occurs towards the diaphysis. So what is right? So does interstitial growth require cartilage? It does. Specifically, what kind of cartilage? Hopefully you said hyaline. So hyaline cartilage is there. Does interstitial growth allow the epiphysis to get thicker? Or allow the epiphyseal plate to get thicker? Let's write that in there so that you know what I'm talking about. No, right? The epiphyseal plate remains the same thickness throughout the whole thing. Cells in the hypertrophic zone are proliferating by mitosis. Hopefully you realize that that's not right. That would be the proliferation zone, right? Or the growth zone. Hypertrophic zone is allowing them to get bigger. The active zone is towards the epiphysis. And so hopefully this is kind of me just seeing if you know what the different zones are, right? There is no active zone, essentially. There is a proliferation zone, which is talking about growth, and there's a calcification or ossification zone, but there's no such thing as essentially an active zone. Ossification occurs towards the diaphysis. And that would be correct, right? So let's talk about the important components of bone, of the bone for growth. So what is the most important mineral salt that forms bone? Hopefully you said the material that's known as hydroxyapatite. And this is essentially a nice word for calcium phosphate. About 70% of the bone material is composed of this. And when we're talking about what's the most important organic compound that forms bone, what's going to provide strength and flexibility in our bone? And the rest of what we have in bone is collagen. And collagen is important there to help with strength and flexibility within the bone. So when we're talking about, let's go on here, true or false, calcium phosphate is known as hydroxyapatite, and it's an important component in cartilage formation. True or false? Hopefully you said false. Why? Because that's the big guy there. Is it for cartilage formation? No, it's for bone formation. And so let's talk about all the different important components for bone growth. And so we have basically vitamin D. And we all know that vitamin D is important, but sometimes we don't know why it's important. And essentially for here, the reason why vitamin D is so important for us to be able to absorb or to have is because basically if you don't have it, you can't have the proper absorption of calcium. And this happens in the small intestines. Right? And so if you don't have proper vitamin D in your diet and you can't absorb calcium right, in children, it leads to the disorder known as rickets. And for adults, it leads to osteomalacia. Now, for the role of vitamin A, is necessary for osteoblast and osteoclast activity. Vitamin C is important because it's required for collagen synthesis. And basically, vitamin K is important for the activation of osteocalcin. And this is a protein in the extracellular bone matrix. Needed to bind and retain calcium in the matrix. So these are all the very important vitamins for bone growth. So what is the role of vitamin A? Hopefully you said osteoblast activity. What's the role of vitamin K? Hopefully here you said D, activation of osteocalcin, which again is a protein that is needed to bind and retain calcium in bone matrix. And so we talked a little bit about this already when we were talking about calcium levels in the blood, but there are hormonal regulations of not just calcium levels in the blood, but bone growth. And so you have growth hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary, and we'll talk more about that when we get at the end of the semester, when we talk about the endocrine system. But it's important in stimulating the epiphyseal plate activity in infancy through childhood, right? The thyroid hormone is important because it modulates and regulates activity of growth hormone. So this guy is going to activate him. It also ensures proper proportions in regards to bone. And then we have testosterone and estrogen. Testosterone of cows, of course, in males, and estrogen in females that get released at puberty. And this basically helps to promote adolescent growth spurts and basically ends growth by inducing epiphyseal plate closure. So this essentially ends the longitudinal growth. And the excess or deficits of any of these can cause abnormal skeleton growth. You can get stuff like increasing can cause giantism of growth hormone, and decreasing can cause dwarfism. And basically what happens here is how your hormones are regulated in your body are controlled by genes. And those genes, if they alter these kind of balancing or these normal hormonal sequences, then you can get either too much of it, which causes giantism, or too little of this growth hormone being released, and that's what causes the small stature. So that's longitudinal growth. So, hormonal regulation, let's choose all that apply. A, the anterior pituitary releases growth hormone, which inhibits epiphyseal plate activity. Thyroid hormone regulate growth hormone. Increased amounts of testosterone can cause giantism. Estrogen levels control epiphyseal closure. So let's go through each of these and let's find out if they apply. So, the anterior pituitary releases growth hormone, which inhibits epiphyseal plate activity. Well, hopefully you realize that this part here is right, but this word right there makes this wrong because it helps to stimulate it. So this one is incorrect. Thyroid hormone modulates growth hormone, and that would be true, right? That the thyroid hormone can help to turn it on and off. It regulates growth hormone. Increase in testosterone can cause giantism. Hopefully you realize that this is wrong, that the increased amounts of growth hormone can cause giantism, right? Testosterone helps to regulate and promote growth spurts or increase growth during adolescence, but it doesn't necessarily lead to giantism. Estrogen levels can control epiphyseal closure. That is right as well. So let's talk about oppositional growth. And this is as lengthening bones continue to grow, apoppositional growth will allow them to widen. And this can be known essentially as bone remodeling. And bone remodeling happens all through our adulthood. Basically what happens is osteoblasts are beneath that periosteum. They secrete bone matrix on the external part of the bone. Now we don't want the bone to get too heavy. So essentially as we're adding bone matrix to the outside of the bone, we're going to have osteoclasts remove bone on the endosteal surface. So this is the surface on the inside that lines the medullary cavity. There's usually more building up than breaking down. So this leads to thicker, stronger bones, but we do need some breakdown because we do not want them to be too heavy, right? And so there is a coordinated remodeling between osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and basically these make what are known as remodeling. These guys together, right, make what's known as remodeling units. And so here kind of gives you an idea what's happening here. And basically you're going to get endochondral ossification that's occurring at the articular surface and in the plate. I think my thing is dead. Let me see if I can get this to, give me 1 second. Does this work? Yeah. And so what you see here, guys, is essentially bone growth and bone remodeling. So on the left-hand side, if you look up towards the top, you can see that the cartilage is growing towards our articular cartilage surface, right? And basically bone replaces cartilage in that area. You can also see at the epiphyseal plate that you're getting cartilage growing there, and then towards the diaphysis, the bone is replacing the cartilage. So that's how longitudinal growth happens. Now, if you look to the right, you'll notice bone remodeling. And you can see that essentially what's happened is that there is that red dotted line that shows that bone had been reabsorbed in that outside area there. And essentially you can see where apoppositional growth has added to the bottom where the diaphysis has happened. And then bone has been removed on that kind of outsider, that kind of initial surface, right, on the outside, so that you can essentially make that area that's closer to the diaphysis a little smaller. And then if you've noticed, they've removed some of the bone or reabsorbed it in that medullary cavity. Let me see if I can get this. Sorry. Let me try that. Okay. So, here and here, you have bone that's being reabsorbed. And here, you've had bone that's essentially been added. So essentially, you can see that compared to this has gotten a little bit wider, of course, because you've added bone, but they've had to remove some of that so it doesn't get too thick and heavy from here. And then to make sure that our area is right and okay for our articulation here, it's going to remodel a little bit on the outside. So bone remodeling is basically apoppositional growth. Bone growth here is longitudinal growth. So bone remodeling, is it A, occurs through life, B, when osteocytes below the peristenum secrete bone matrix on external bones, C, osteoclasts remove bones on endosteal surfaces, D, usually less building than breaking, or E, both B and C. So bone remodeling does occur throughout life, right? It does occur when the osteocytes below the peristenum, does it? No, it doesn't. What's wrong here is this part of this statement, right? What should it be? Good. It should be osteoblast. Below the peristenum, secrete bone matrix on the external bone. You almost let me do that. How dare you? Anyway, and then osteoclasts remove bones on the endosteal surface. This would be correct, right? So this should be A and C, not B and C. Hopefully you didn't just see that and go, oh, that's got to be right. And the last one says less building than breaking, which is wrong, right? There's normally more building than breaking. And so bone homeostasis occurs continuously, but it's regulated by genetic factors in two control loops. You have a negative feedback loop, that's hormonal, that helps with calcium homeostasis in the blood. So basically what it is this negative feedback loop is controlling how much calcium is in the blood. It has nothing to do with essentially your bone or how much is there. Now, basically bones recycle every 5 to 7% of your bone mass each week. And spongy bone gets replaced every 3 to 4 years, and compact bone gets replaced every 10 years. So in that regards, you do constantly kind of throughout your life replace your bone mass. Older bone can become more brittle. The calcium start to crystallize, and that's what happens as you get older, and fractures are more easily allowed to occur. Now, basically, bone homeostasis consists of both bone remodeling and bone repair. And we've talked about bone remodeling here. And like I mentioned earlier, that basically bone remodeling has genetic and control loops, negative feedback. We talked about that when we were talking about electrolyte balance in blood. Basically, bone remodeling also responds to mechanical and gravitational forces. So on here, it all is dependent on basically how much pressure you have on us. And we're at a certain ATM or atmospheric pressure all the time. So that pressure is going to essentially, especially if you lose weight or gain weight, the pressure points are going to be a little bit different amount of force being generated on different parts of your bones and in your body. So bone remodeling is essentially regulated by that. Now, when we're talking about bone remodeling, it's not uniformed. If you're looking at a femur, the distal parts get replaced every 5 to 6 months or so, and essentially the shaft or the diaphysis of it is a little bit slower. So even in the bones, the different areas of the bone gets remodeled at a different rate. Sorry. And so when we're talking about how basically calcium hormonal controls are, if you remember this a little bit, you basically have what starts as parathyroid hormone gets released, right? And that's going to activate osteoclasts that then are going to degrade bone matrix and release calcium into the blood. Then calcium goes up, right? And so if you need calcium for anything in your body, that's what's going to happen. To do this, though, the bad thing is it does basically tear or degrade your bones. Now, once you have enough calcium or and you have too much and you want it to kind of go back, right? This essentially will rise it. Now, if something happens in your body again where you're losing too much calcium and it's starting to fall, then again, parathyroid hormone activates again, right? Increases this, basically helps to release. So essentially, this is the start over here, right? Calcium levels fall, parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid, that's the small circles here, gets released, activates osteoclasts, calcium levels rise, right? Now, there is something in adipose, basically leptin, and it inhibits osteoblasts. And so this can essentially decrease bone density and can be a problem in the bones, right? We want to make sure our bone density is fine. So that's one way that you can also worry about, I'm not making enough bone or not having enough. Now, how this is the hormonal controls, and it said there are mechanical controls as well, or mechanical stress, which is a result of essentially gravitational stress can be. So bones are stressed when weight is put on them or when a muscle is pulling on them. If the weight is high or high bearing, it can usually, especially if we're looking at the hip bones here, they can be usually off center, so it tends to bend the bone. Bending compresses on one side and stretches on the other. And so basically that's going to activate the need for bone remodeling, right? Long bones are thickest midway along the diaphysis, where bending is the greatest. And so essentially, let's go through here, you have this, right? And so this is what it's talking about. This is your femur, right? And this is what's going into your hip joint. So when you're going, all that weight is getting pressed on the head of the femur. Now, when you're looking at this, you can see there's this line, right? So as this is getting pushed down, the greatest basically point of stress is going to be in these overall areas over here, right? And so this is the point of no stress. You have compression happening here. You have tension happening here. And you'll notice on this top part, it's the thickest because there's more stress. So in this area down here, because there's no stress, this is going to be the thinnest. And it's the thinnest on the inside, right? Because there's that minimal kind of center there. But you're going to get these bigger, thicker spots over here to try to help protect it against all this extra weight. So that's basically mechanical stress. Now, there is this thing called Wolff's Law. And basically, Wolff's Law just says that bones grow and remodel in response to the demands placed on it. So you can think about handedness, right? If you're right or left-handed, have you ever looked at that one side of your body is a little thicker and stronger? And that's because you're using it more. Curved bones are thickest where they're most likely to buckle. So you can come back and look at this femur area. Oops. Right? Up here, being extremely thick on this side, where it looks like it's going to be more likely to buckle or break. Basically, trabeculae are going to form these truces along the line of stress, and so they're going to kind of come together to help with creating more kind of make it a lot hardier, right? Also, you're going to have projections. What we looked at, all the bones can occur. So wherever there are heavy active muscles that are attaching to them, right? And so these areas that are going to get more stress on them are going to be a lot thicker. And so you can think of the fact of elderly, like bones of fetus and bedridden individuals don't remodel adequately because there's not enough mechanical stress on them. That's why if you don't go run a lot, you don't want to go out and just run a ton because you're going to get stress fractures because your bones aren't thick enough yet to handle the additional weight. So, or the force that's placed on them. It's the same happens with people that are bedridden that can't get out, and then you try to move them and it seems like their bones break because they become very, very brittle because of the fact they're starting to atrophy because there's not enough stress being placed on them.
If this blow hit you, it could shatter bones, trigger hemorrhaging, even damage vital organs. The body truly is a weapon. On the impact criteria, it scored a knockout. But how did he do it? Human long bones are like drinking straws, hollow in the middle and stronger on the long axis. Weaker when bent. They are softest, called spongy bone on the ends.
That would have broken the normal person's hand. So we know that there's some type of bone remodeling going on.
That's the secret. Hard body training actually transforms the bone itself. It's called Wolff's Law, based on the pioneering discoveries of 19th century surgeon Julius Wolff. These are the structures in human bone. Trabeculae, Latin for little beams. When bones are traumatized over and over, they lay down more calcium structures, more little beams. The bones become denser, harder, more durable. Ancient martial artists knew the secret of Wolff's Law long before modern science. For centuries, they've trained by breaking boards, striking sand, iron, stone. That which does not kill you really does make you stronger.
Okay, so this just kind of shows you that if you're looking at bone remodeling, essentially Wolff's Law, that here is a non-serving arm and her serving arm. So you can see that essentially one area is much thicker than the other. That you have this extra added bone matrix, and essentially that bone matrix there is adding, is basically adding bone to counteract the added stress, right? And so this happens all the time in the area of your bones that get more stress to them. So true or false? Wolff's Law explains why bones subjected to more stress become thicker due to added bone matrix. Hopefully you said true. So let's talk about bone repair, okay? Basically, when you have fractures are just another term for breaks, right? And in youth, most fractures result from trauma, something that the child or when you're younger in life that you do to essentially cause some kind of break, whether it's sports or falling or doing just something that is traumatic. In older age, most of the time though, the breaks that you see are more of a result of bone thinning out and becoming weak than it is from some kind of trauma. So when we're talking about bones and fractures, we essentially classify bones in we can classify fractures a certain way. Give me 1 second here. Sorry, my little Apple pen or pencil is being silly on me. Okay, so they can be first classified by basically the position of the bone ends after fracture. So you can have what's known as a non-displaced or displaced. Non-displaced just means that the ends retain normal position. And the displaced means that the ends are out of position. The next is the completeness of the break. So there is what's known as a complete and an incomplete. Complete means it's broken all the way. And incomplete would be that it's not broken all the way. So when I mean broken all the way, I'm talking about a complete break is something that goes all the way through the bone, where an incomplete break means that it's not broken all the way through. Another way that you can classify is whether the skin is penetrated. So you have an open, otherwise known as a compound, or a closed, otherwise known as a simple. And so in the open, it means that the skin is penetrated. In the closed, it means the skin is not penetrated. And then, of course, you have other ways. And so things like spontaneous fractures, normally something that's resulting from disease. So they also have basically very specific breaks and parts or specific parts of your body that are labeled. So for instance, if you have a Cole's fracture, And so this is a break in the distal radius. And this normally happens when you reach your arms out to stop a fall, right? And so this is most common in patients that have osteoporosis. Most of the time when you fall, when you reach your hands out, you may bruise yourself, but you're not actually causing a break in the distal part of your radius. But think about this. If you become where you are, your bones are getting more and more weak, then that kind of fracture is going to be more likely to happen. You also have what's known as Pott's fracture. And basically, this is a break in the ankle, and it's normally in the distal fibula. So this is just the common ankle break. So let's look at some of these. So here, go through here. Comminuted is basically, this is an example of a complete fracture. It's normally due to high energy force. This, when you're looking at it, is a bone fragment are actually into 3 or more different pieces. This is very common in the aged. Again, people that have more brittle bones or osteoporosis is a problem that they may have. Now, compressed fractures are essentially when you've crushed bone, and this again is common in osteoporotic bones. So sometimes this can happen in extreme trauma, as in major falls. So a perfect example of this you can see in the picture is like a crushed vertebrae. Spiral fractures, this is due to torsion force. So essentially, and this is a complete break. So if you have this torsion force, is this idea of force happening through twisting. And so this is a common fracture that you see in sports. Thinking about if you're moving really, really fast in football and someone grabs onto your leg to try to get you down and you try to quickly turn, that force that's put on the turn can cause this fracture. Epiphyseal fractures are these fractures that happen when the epiphyseal plate breaks and separates the epiphysis from the diaphysis. This tends to occur when cartilage cells are dying and calcification in the matrix is occurring. And so this is considered a complete fracture. Depressed fractures are basically typical in skull fractures, and this is happening when something is pressed inward. So this happens most times in falls where you hit your head, or if someone's trying to hit you over the head with something, right? Green sticks, these are common in children. And these, if you can do, it's an incomplete fracture, so it's more like a hairline fracture. And so because the bones essentially aren't broken all the way, it's kind of, they call it this because if you can think of a green twig when you're trying to break them, it doesn't break easily, and it's because they're very flexible. And children's bones have more organic matrix in them than adult bones, more of that cartilage, more of the collagen present, so they tend to be more flexible than adults. And so with the extreme bending, it'll just get a small break on one side, but it won't break all the way through to the next. So let's talk about which fracture is correct here. We have compression, which is bone crushed. Comminuted, which is complete bone fracture in 3+ places. Spiral fracture due to torsion force, or green stick, incomplete fracture common in children. So is A correct? That would be, right? We talked about that in regards to crushed vertebrae. How about B? This would be correct. And this was an example in aged patients whose bones essentially become more brittle. So when they break it, it seems to break in more places. Spiral, or C. That would be correct, right? And these basically spiral fractions happen most commonly in sports. And then D. That would be correct. So all of these are essentially correct. So how can we treat common fractures? And essentially we have a big part that we think about is immobilization. And this is when we make it so that it can't move. It happens by cast or traction. And this really, whether they do this or not, and the type that they use depends on break severity, broken bones, and the age of the patient. Now there's also what's known as reduction, and this is when they realign broken bone ends together, and there's both closed and open. And basically closed reduction means that the physician doesn't have to actually do anything but manipulate it to the correct position. An open reduction is when they actually have to put it in surgical pins or wires because it's broken in such a way that they need to secure the ends to make sure that it heals right. And then in a lot of times they can use these guys together. So let's talk about the stage of bone repair. So how does bone repair work? So essentially when we're talking about bone repair, the very first thing that happens is that a hematoma forms. And hematoma is just a fancy word for a blood clot. And so essentially blood escapes from broken vessels whenever this happens. And that's where this blood clot or hematoma is going to come from. Now, once that forms, the next thing that happens is essentially you're going to get this fibrocartilaginous callus that forms. And you can see the internal callus is happening right here. And essentially what happens is you get fibroblasts that secrete collagen and connective bone here. And that helps to kind of form that beginning area that essentially then can be replaced later by spongy bone. So this is basically forming from cartilage, this fibrocartilaginous, right, callus. This happens in about 3 to 4 weeks. Now, a bony callus will start forming, and you can see here that this is where you're starting to form spongy bone. This happens within 3 to 4 months. And essentially here, you're having osteoblasts that are creating bone from the matrix that's present. And step 4 is basically at this point, because sometimes you'll notice here that you have the areas on the outside and you want this to be very, very nice and flat, you're going to get bone remodeling happening. So you might have osteoclasts that come in and start eating out of some of the areas to make it nice and aligned with both sides. Or you may even have more osteoblasts depending on pressure and the mechanical stress that's happening. And so let's watch a quick video. This video is going to show you how fractures are healed. These are all different factors that are going to help to recruit the appropriate cells. You do not need to know that. let's order our choices correct. So on here, which one is number 1? Essentially, we have hematoma or a clot forms first, right? And then after the clot forms, we have what? We have the fibrocartilaginous callus forms. And then once the callus forms from the collagen and the basically the cartilage, right? What do we have happen after that? The bony callus forms, and then lastly we have bone remodeling, which that video showed a really good process and kind of gave you an idea of what it looked like overall. And so when we have imbalances in our osseous tissue, it leads to a disorder called osteoporosis. And this disorder is essentially a group of diseases. And basically what happens is reabsorption outpaces the deposit of bone. And so on here, spongy bone of the spine and the neck of the femur are the most susceptible. That's the reason why in the elderly, you'll see vertebral and hip fractures that are the most common. In here, there are risk factors. And so the risk factors that we have is basically most common is aged, right? Followed by postmenopausal women. So, age postmenopausal women between the age of 60 and 70, right, years. About 30% of the population of postmenopausal women between the age of 60 and 70, 30% has some kind of osteoporosis. By the age of 80 years, 70% do. And the biggest reason why this happens is because the sex hormones become depleted and you need them to maintain bone. So in here, you're more likely to have if you have a petite body form. If you don't get enough exercise, you have a poor diet, basically that's poor in calcium and protein, you smoke, you have a hormone-related disease. So, hyperthyroidism is associated with osteoporosis. Low levels of thyroid-stimulating hormone. Or diabetes. You're more likely to have osteoporosis if you are immobile. And if you are a male with prostate cancer, because with prostate cancer, you have to take an androgen suppressing drug, and those wreak havoc on your calcium levels and bone. Androgen suppressing drug. And essentially for women, the highest risk in the age postmenopausal women, it's more common to see osteoporosis in Caucasian women and Asian women. And you can disregard the lab assignment. We are not doing that this semester. And so this kind of gives you an idea of the difference between what a normal bone looks like, or the spongy bone, right, and osteoporotic bone. And so are only women affected by osteoporosis? True or false? That is false. Men are as well. It's just women are affected by at a higher rate. And the last part we're going to talk about here is metastatic bone disease. Oh, actually, let's talk about, before I go on really quick, let's talk about how we treat osteoporosis. So you can do it with calcium, vitamin D supplements. You can do weight-bearing exercises. You can try hormone replacement therapy. So hormone replacement therapy can slow bone loss, but it's not going to reverse the loss you have. It can be very controversial because it helps or increases the risk of things like heart attack, stroke, and breast cancer. And some take the estrogenic compounds in soy as a substitute for hormone replacement therapy. But like I said, it is a bit controversial. There are drugs designed to decrease osteoclast activity in numbers. And you can use drugs that mimic estrogen. And why would you do that? You don't want all the side effects that estrogen can give you. So things like statin drugs, these can help increase bone mineral density, and antibody drugs. Antibody drugs can also help with bone density. How can you prevent? So this is treating it, right? How can we prevent osteoporosis? Calcium in your diet. Lots and lots of calcium in early adulthood. Reduce sodas or carbonated drinks and alcohol consumption. The problem with carbonated beverages and alcohol consumption is that it basically leaches minerals from the bone, so it decreases bone density. And then plenty of weight-bearing exercise. All of those can help to basically buffer against age-related bone loss. And the last is metastatic disease or bone cancer. There's three main types: osteolytic, osteoblastic, and then a combination of both. Osteolytic is when you have holes and weakness in bone. Osteoblastic cancer would be increase in bone formation. And then most times you'll have a combination of both, where you're depositing bone where you're not supposed to, and other areas that are weak, so overgrown and weak areas. Virtually any type of cancer can be spread to the bones, but the cancer most likely to cause bone metastasis cancer includes breast cancer, kidney cancer, lung cancer, lymphoma, multiple myeloma, prostate cancer, and thyroid cancer. Now, bone cancer is known or seen most likely in long bone. The cause is unknown. There are three types of bone cancer. So basically the difference between metastatic bone disease is that you're getting it from cancer somewhere else and it's coming to your bones. Bone cancer essentially originates in the bones. So you have osteosarcoma. This begins in the bones. It can be present in children and young adults, and it's most commonly seen in the legs and arms. Chondrosarcoma is basically in the cartilage before or the cartilage that is found around bones. It happens in middle age, and it's found most commonly in the pelvis, the legs, and the arms. In Ewing syndrome, it's unknown beginning. It's most commonly seen in children and young adults, and you can find it in the pelvis, legs, and arms. So bone cancer starts outside the bone when a metastasis from another area. The types of bone cancer is osteolytic and osteoblastic. And this would be false, that bone cancer originates inside the bone, right? It's the metastasis bone cancer that originates outside. And so that's it for Unit 9.